socially sensitive sectors. Let me also request all of you to join me in wishing Arima a very happy birthday. Today is her birthday. So let us wish her with many, many happy returns of the day. On that good note, and also another good news, which is related to the topic of this session, employment in the gig economy we're talking about. Yesterday, and this is perhaps coincidental, yesterday we got the good news that this year's Nobel Prize in Economics has been awarded to Claudia Goldin. She is known for her work on labor welfare, particularly women workers. And for years, for decades, she has been working on reasons, on sources of wage and other inequality in the labor market. And some of these issues we are going to discuss in today's session. Now, before I come to the today's topic and our panelists, four of them are virtual, so it's going to be slightly challenging, perhaps, to manage this. But anyway, let me try to recall what we discussed yesterday. I'm not getting into the specific sectors, but the essentially what we discussed yesterday, that the role of the government is govern good governance on the part of government, and by government I mean everybody in the system of governance is good governance, and competition policy, implementation of competition law, regulatory policies, they are all institutions for good governance. And that is how one a country develops its economic democracy. And there has been huge literature on this. I'll just refer to one of them. I am sure that many of you must have read it. The Narrow Corridor by Darren Acemoglu, that how economic democracy, through the working of economic institutions in particular, along with, of course, social and political institutions, shape a country's overall growth, overall development. So on that note, let's get into this business. Unfortunately, Samar Verma, he is unable to join us for some unavoidable reasons. So we are going to have six uh, presenters, speakers. So let's start with Marat. Marat Umarov is the chairman of the Agency for Protection and Development of Competition of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Marat is going to join us virtually. I don't know, Marat, do you have any presentation or are you going to speak on this topic?
Good morning. No. Wait,
Morning.
I have my points with me.
Sorry?
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Yes. Yeah, no, I don't have a presentation. I just have a few points to share with you.
Thank you, Marat. So your topic is competition reforms, denationalization, and workers' interest. So on that topic, let's hear from Marat in 8 to 10 minutes. Over to you, Marat.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, good morning to everyone. I'd like to greet our moderator and our panelists. I'll try to be brief. Again, the topic of our discussion today is the gig economy and the role of competition, as you mentioned. I guess from list of panelists that I have in front of me who will be speaking, I will be able to prioritize, I think, from my side, from our jurisdiction. I'll try to focus more on the policy and the the actual cases that we, as a competition authority in Kazakhstan, we see at the moment, and I'll try to be as useful on the practitioner side to everybody. So, first of all, I would like to say that our jurisdiction is obviously heavily involved in the gig economy. Most of our employment that we are seeing as a case comes in two sectors, and our competition authority at the moment investigates two markets. First, that I would like to share with you. First one is our taxi service, a platform service, and food delivery service. I'm not going to name names of the companies because we're still in courts with those particular companies, but some things, I guess, have been public and I can share with you and our concerns that we have. First of all, the taxi platform service that we have been investigating here in Kazakhstan has managed to monopolize almost 80% of the markets here in Kazakhstan. And obviously, we do have a lot of complaints from demand and supply side, so it will be consumers and employers. And I think will be particularly interesting to this audience and academics that have been studying gig labor markets is that what we have found, the complaints that we receive from drivers and employers in this particular platform have been complaining that we don't have a particular call center here in Kazakhstan because the company that operates in our jurisdiction is not really registered in our jurisdiction. So for us, just legally speaking, it has been quite difficult to receive information, study the papers, and just basic transaction costs are quite high. But what we have seen is that those gig economy workers has actually managed to splash into occasional social unrests, and on the supply side. And on the demand side, we see a lot of requests coming into our agency that the fees and the commissions are quite high. So in terms of our investigation and our response, it's, I don't know, a classic antitrust authority response that we've been trying to study the markups, algorithmic pricing, and etc. But what we have found challenging, and what my colleagues have been challenging, because when we investigate traditional markets, we don't really dwell into labor markets issues. And what we have seen, as you mentioned in the beginning, the difficulty of good governance, it has to go multidimensional. So when we look into this case, we have reached out to our colleagues from Labor Ministry, Ministry of Transport, to help us identify the issue and tackle it. And what we have seen is that those workers and the complaints that we receive are, first of all, obviously the pricing issues, but second of all, it's purely labor code issues. So they will just complain that they don't receive their bonuses in time. Call centers don't work because they're not registered in our jurisdiction. And the standards of employment are quite low. Obviously, we have an expectation as a former Soviet Republic country of high labor codes, that the labor rights are protected and quite rigid. But in these cases, we will see don't, and it wasn't quite an issue for us. And the wider public obviously doesn't really understand how these issues will be dealt by our authority or tax authority, for example. And obviously these cases are multidimensional, and for us it is quite challenging to tackle this issue on our own. And again, coming back to your issue, that good governance requires a strong response from all authorities involved, and it's especially the case when we deal with a platform that operates kind of existentially from our jurisdiction. And this issue we have raised, and those labor cost issues we managed to settle through a compliance and leniency programs that we have at the moment. We're still ongoing, but this particular case, as you mentioned, in the gig economy, has raised issues across other markets. So now we look into the same concerns in the food delivery business that we have. Kind of the same concerns because, again, we have looked at the average age of workers that work in this industry. It's 18 to 24 years of age. And again, standards of safety, moral support, and minimum wage issues are the same. And it was interesting what that we have looked at is that no matter the market that a certain platform operates, those issues are the same. So I'll be very interested to hear the academic side of the debate on this, of how especially competition authorities should tackle these issues. How do we look into the labor issue sides? So my idea today was to share with you our concerns from our jurisdiction, of what we deal day to day with these kind of platforms in our country. And again, I'll be very happy to hear the research that has been done by some of the panelists today on this, and any suggestions that we could, as policymakers and practitioners, use in our daily work. Thank you.
Thank you, Marat. See, let me clarify that I should have done it in the beginning, that by gig economy, we just don't mean platform-based economy or workers who are engaged in such economies. The definition of the gig economy is contractual employment. That's the simplest definition. And it has been happening for centuries. I mean, it's not that something which is new. On that point, Uma, I have a proposal before you, Uma. Your topic is emerging roadmap for gig workers' welfare. Now, this is quite broad, and we are very keen to hear you, particularly because you are from the International Labour Organization, ILO. But would it be all right if I request you to speak after hearing the other speakers? Then perhaps you would be able to reflect on some of these points and then give us a broad overview about the welfare aspects of gig workers, if it is all right with you. Otherwise, we are going to hear you now, and then we'll go as per the agenda. Uma?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bipul. I think I completely agree with you. I'm very happy to go in the end. And it's unfortunate that we won't have Summer, because I thought it was a nice, follow-up to what Summer would say, that I would come in. But as he's not there, I'm happy to go in the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Uma. I mean, unfortunately, again, someone called me again this morning saying, I mean, he's caught up in an emergency meeting, and he may join us. I don't know. Anyway, so let me now come to Joseph. We know each other for a long time in the competition field. He is now based in McGill University in Canada. So Joseph is going to speak on the use of competition law and policy tools against supply chain abuses in the labor market. So Joseph, I guess you have a PowerPoint presentation, or are you going to speak
I
like
have
this?
a PowerPoint I shared with the.
Yeah, can somebody put it up? Joseph Wilson's PowerPoint presentation. And there is also a question before you,
Yes, sir.
that how and what competition policy tools can be used to address supply chain abuses in the labor market. How can we get these tools included in national and global strategies? Joseph, please.
Yes. Well, thank you very much to Kutz for giving me this opportunity. So the topic is the supply chain abuses and competition law, and thank you for clarifying the definition of gig economy. For somehow it does appear that it's related to platform, but gig is all contractual work that that somebody does, and I'm using the example of bonded labor both in India and Pakistan to highlight some the point I want to make. And the point is on upfront, I should say, the question is it the consumer welfare standard that we are pursuing? What is the objective the competition law has to pursue? Now, this presentation, let me do my share screen.
Yeah, your presentation is there, Joseph.
Okay,
I
so
can see
somebody
it.
can, how will I change this? Okay. Okay, what is supply chain abuse? What do we mean by it? It simply refers to the use of input products or services which are obtained illegitimately or in violation of some law, be it a national law or any global standard to which the country has subscribed through a treaty or convention. Example of supply chain abuses are violation of labor laws, bonded labor, employment of children, stealing of raw material, timber, for example, and use of pirated software and the like. So the cost saving, how does supply these abuse in supply chain affects fair competition? The cost savings arising from supply chain abuses benefit companies selling the finished product. Such ill-begotten savings unfairly undercut legitimate competitors, thereby engendering unfair competition. Here is a chart of bonded labor as a supply chain abuse, and this is an estimated prevalence of modern slavery in Asia Pacific. Pakistan ranks number 3. India is number 15 on the chart, and then followed by Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So in our region, bonded labor, particularly in bricklaying industry and in carpet weaving industry and other industries of such sort, is quite prevalent. And this is a contractual work. It's a gig work. So the question that comes is, next slide, please, is can competition law prevent bonded labor? And it depends how you look at competition law, whether competition law is driven to enhance consumer welfare or whether it is there to prevent market failure. Now, I'll pause here for a moment and ask this question to the audience. Is it the golden egg or the hen that lays it more important? Is it the golden egg is the consumer welfare and the competitive market is the hen? To me, the answer is very obvious, and it's the market that needs to be preserved. It's the market that needs to be the competition agency has to ensure that it's functioning properly. So ensuring low prices is not the end, although for some reason consumer welfare standard has taken a since 70s and onward has taken the main role as the objective of the competition law, but and now this has again evolved. This question is whether this is the right standard or not, and I think it is about time to look into it, because it's not the low prices, high quality goods. It's all the byproducts of a process. It is the process that needs to be preserved, and that process is revelatory in the markets. So rather, it is the functioning of markets which create employment opportunities, source of livelihood for the poor, and opportunity to grow and flourish for the entrepreneurs. These are the functionings of the market, which produces one set of outcomes, which is employment opportunity. And then the byproduct is the consumer welfare. So for a competition agency, the focus should be more on preserving the health of the hen rather than just looking at the egg. So bonded labor hit the core output of competitive markets, that is employment opportunities. It distorts competition by giving competitive advantage to one employing bonded labor and disadvantage to one who employed on legal standards. So the conclusion is, that competition agencies should push the frontiers of their enforcement by focusing on ensuring fair employment opportunities. Now, how would they do that in the case of bonded labor? That's the question that I'm trying to respond that was put in the beginning. There are multiple ways, and these are not conclusive way to do it, but abuse of dominant provision is one that competition agencies can invoke. For that, the market definition has to be very narrow, and there's nothing wrong in having a narrow market definition. So the idea of having a per se illegality as we have it in cartelization or prohibited agreements, there could be a per se abuse of dominance. So if there is a per se abuse of dominance, then the size doesn't matter. It's a de minimis. So that's one way of looking into or addressing this kind of issue. The other is that I had in mind is for a competition agency to cooperate with labor standard, the departments which enforce labor standards, to work with them and form a joint scheme or some technique to address this kind of bonded labor. So with this, I conclude my presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
I think you have raised a very important, you have iterated it, that the main objective of any competition agency is to ensure that competitive market conditions prevail. Rest of the things, whether it is consumer welfare or whatever other, they are going to come as a result of competition in the marketplace itself. And there, in that context, defining market is very, very important. Sometimes it's challenging, but that is where the crux of the matter lies. So on that note, let me now come to Thomas Cheng. Thomas is going to talk about biosphere and labor welfare. He is a professor in the Faculty of Law, University of Hong Kong. And I understand that, Thomas, you have a PowerPoint presentation. So briefly, in about 10-12 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to CUTS for having me here. And it's always a privilege to speak to CUTS. I believe this is my third time speaking at a CUTS conference. My focus is going to be slightly different from, for example, what Joseph said just now. I guess when I thought about gig economy, I was thinking more of the digital platform workers. And so the issue that I want to look into today may seem a little esoteric to some of you, although I don't think so, because I believe Ola, I think is So so my focus is on Uber. So that's what my research was focused on. And I guess the frame of reference is mostly the US. Uber's operation in the U.S. and in particular, this presentation was very timely. Before I arrived in India last night, I was in Los Angeles for another conference at UC Irvine, and I got picked up at the airport. Took an Uber to UC Irvine, which is about an hour away, and the taxi driver was very friendly. He's from the Philippines, and he proceeded to give me his entire life story over the ride. But we also compared prices, how much I paid and how much Uber paid him. And it turns out I paid $86 to Uber, and he got $50. And I don't know about you guys, but I was shocked because I was told that Uber usually hits. So some of you may know in the classic monopsony scenario, the welfare implications are that the monopsonist, the mirror image of the monopolist buyer in the labor market would reduce his requirements in the labor market and thereby suppressing prices paid to workers. The classic monopsony obviously is not confined to the labor market, but when applied to the labor market, what a classic monopsonist does is to reduce his intake of the input of production, here labor, and offer lower prices the possibility is, depending on the downstream market, it could lead to higher prices as a result of the reduced output in the downstream market. And so my question is, so the research question I look at is, does this happen when Uber exercises its buyer power? And in particular, my focus is on what Uber can do with its technology. And there's evidence that Uber can engage in what is called algorithmic targeting. And by that, I mean Uber can actually change the prices and terms offered to its drivers depending on their commitment to Uber. And in particular, there is something called a HELL program that Uber has implemented, which allows Uber to offer better terms, more rebates, and more rides to drivers who also drive for Lyft, the main competitor of Uber in the US. And I mean, this is part of my bigger research project on the possibility of individualized pricing in the online market. And my research focuses both on the consumer side and on the labor side. But I mean, today I'm only going to speak about labor. And next slide, please. So what Uber is able to do is to combine its data, and Uber has something called a HELL program. But to cut a long story short, the HELL program effectively allows Uber to tailor the terms it offers to its drivers who multi-home with Lyft, and basically to try to take more business, to keep the drivers almost exclusive. I mean, there are drivers who only drive for Uber, the drivers who only drive for Lyft, and there are those who do both, and including the driver who drove me to from the Los Angeles airport. And Uber obviously wants, Uber doesn't like drivers multi-homing, driving for both. So it uses the HELL program to offer incentives I mean, Uber does not enter into explicit exclusive dealing arrangements with these drivers, but instead Uber offers enticements to get these drivers to de facto go exclusive with Uber. And there are not a lot of things that Uber's competitors can do short of spending more money or actually even entering into illegal, possibly illegal exclusive agreements with these drivers. So next slide, please. There is a big question is, can Uber do that? To what extent can Uber truly, I guess, price discriminate, to use the term loosely, against its drivers to offer more specific terms to entice its drivers? So the idea is, in a classic monopsony scenario, the monopsonist would have to offer the same price across the market. And what the implication of that is, when a monopsonist has to reduce its market demand for the inputs, and in this case labor, across the entire market, and offer the same price, there would be a reduction in market output, and there would also be a deadweight loss. But Uber's ability to engage in what I call algorithmic targeting against drivers is that it allows Ubers to practice what approaches first degree price discrimination. And when the implication of that is, Uber would be able to offer individual prices to individual drivers, and allowing Uber to price discriminate, and basically the welfare implications of that would be to remove the deadweight loss in the market, and Uber would be able to monopsonize the market without creating the welfare welfare loss, the deadweight loss in the market. And but Uber would also be able to expropriate all the producer surplus from the drivers. Perhaps that's what I experienced in my ride to Los Angeles, from Los Angeles airport. And there are some questions as to what extent can Uber do this effectively. But I think Uber actually has the technical capacity to engage in this kind of algorithmic targeting fairly effectively. Uber has a lot of data on drivers. Uber pays its drivers on a per trip basis, which increases Uber's ability to tailor compensation based on the driver's commitments to Uber. Uber does not pay a monthly salary, as we all know. Drivers are compensated on a per ride basis, which allows Uber to tailor its compensation for drivers in a much more targeted manner. And Uber possesses a lot of data on the drivers. I mean, in some jurisdictions, actually in California, for example, Uber drivers now know where they're going to before they take a ride. I'm not sure what the situation is in India. I know, for example, in Hong Kong, Uber drivers do not know where they're going before they take a ride. But I was talking to the driver in Los Angeles. He told me that they now do. But obviously, that's not the same as knowing the price. But I think drivers generally can estimate how much they'll get paid based on the distance of the ride and the time of the day, etc. And so, if Uber has that information, I mean, if drivers know roughly in advance how much a ride is, and Uber can then estimate drivers' responses, reaction to what gets offered to them, higher price, lower price, whether the drivers are willing to take a ride or not. And so this kind of information can allow Uber to estimate the elasticity of labor supply, to what extent drivers respond to more monetary incentives, which would allow Uber to tailor its pay to the drivers in a much more targeted manner. And next slide, please. So what are the welfare implications and competitive implications of all this? So as I mentioned, by engaging in algorithmic targeting, Uber can actually minimize the classic welfare harm of a classic monopolist. In a classic monopoly scenario, that would be that way loss, that would be reduced output in the market. But when Uber engages in, I guess, exercise of buyer power using algorithmic targeting, Uber can minimize the deadweight loss. Uber would not have to reduce its requirements in the market. There would be no reduction in the number of drivers, but partly also because there would also not be and that's not because of algorithmic targeting, but because of the fact that Uber operates in the U.S. in a competitive market with Lyft. Even if Uber reduces its labor intake, it would probably, I mean, the market output in terms of rides would probably not go down. And so what that means is there probably would not be significant competitive harm in the downstream markets. And scholars have highlighted a number of other competitive harm resulting from buyer power abuses. For example, quality erosion, lack of incentives to invest in R&D, et cetera, and higher concentration in the supply chain. But none of these would apply in the Uber driver market, because I don't think Uber drivers are going to start driving more recklessly or becoming a poorer driver because of the more targeted pay that Uber offers them. And Uber drivers don't really engage in R&D or invest in improving supply. And I mean, the Uber driver market is the classic atomistic, perfectly competitive market. And so there is probably also unlikely to be greater concentration in the supply chain. And so the only welfare impact, or I guess competitive harm, if you will, of Uber engaging in this exercise of buyer power with the help of algorithms is wealth transfer from the drivers to Uber. And pretty much, I mean, so the 30-something% commission that Uber charges my driver from Los Angeles airport to Irvine, that would be pretty much the only concrete manifestation of competitive harm. And so whether competition authority should intervene depends on whether the competition authority believes that a wealth transfer from drivers to Uber it's an enough reason to intervene. But otherwise, if you survey the other competitive harm that scholars have highlighted from the exercise of buyer power in the context of the driver's market for, I guess, ride platforms such as Uber, and I presume a lot of these analyses would also apply in India. The other competitive harm that has been discussed by scholars don't seem to apply in this market as well. I think that's all I have. Thank you.
I see that there are some interesting results from your research, and perhaps the reason behind the main result we you have arrived at so far, that as compared to classic monopsony, in this case, the welfare and welfare effects are different. Maybe it's because it's a two-sided problem. Whereas in this case, let's take the example of Uber, it's a buyer as well as a seller. It would be interesting if you can take forward, and I'll come to this point in the question answer session as well. If you take forward your model to duopsony as well as to oligopsony, and then see how the market is behaving. The reason why I'm saying this is that in India also we have duopsony, primarily we have Uber, we have Ola, these two. But in some provinces, we are now seeing that very local, and in some cases we are seeing that it's also governmental ride-sharing apps are coming. So it's an emerging story, emerging area of research. So thank you very much for highlighting all these points. Now let me come to Vela. She is a doctoral research student or fellow at the Technical University of Munich School of Governance, and she's going to, sorry, he or she is going to speak on the limits and potentials of competition law in protecting gig workers' rights. Over to you. Are you going to have any PowerPoint, or are you going to speak?
Yeah, I'll
I think
speak and just share.
yeah, in
share
about 10, 12 minutes. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for this topic and for this conference that is focusing on socially sensitive sectors, and the gig economy is one of them. And the issue is that the gig economy is developing so fast, and it's offering workers from the global south opportunities to work. At the same time, as Professor Sheng has noted, is that there's possibility for abuse of monopoly power by digital labor platform. And there's an argument that because of the conceptualization of the employment status of gig workers, there's a need for competition law to step in. And so I'd like to just share something that we've been working on with GIZ, and this is an online course module that we've come up with that focuses on competition in the age of the digital labor platforms. So I will share the link in the chat so that all of us could look at it and also participate in it, earn a certificate, and also share with our students and other people that we know. So I'm going to speak about the limits of competition law in regulating digital labor platforms and protecting workers' conditions, and also reiterate what Professor Sheng has said regarding the characteristics of the digital labor platform market, which is highly concentrated with few workers, with few platforms operating in the market. For instance, in the e-hailing app, we find that Uber and Bolt are the biggest platforms in the specific market. And also the effect of network effects, which has made workers to work for specific platforms because that is where the consumers are found. And if you have a look at the Competition Commission of South Africa preliminary report in the online intermediation platform, you'll realize that one of the findings they found in the food delivery platform is that most riders will work for Mr. Delivery and Uber Eats because most restaurants prefer to be on this platform, and most restaurants prefer to be on this platform because most consumers order from this platform. And also a good example in the e-hailing app, in the research that I've been doing in Kenya and Nigeria, is that drivers will tell you that we are on the platforms where customers are. So a good example in Kenya, you'll find that we have more than 20 platforms beyond Uber, beyond Bolt. We have Farasi, we have Little Cab, but because consumers are not on this platform, therefore drivers work with only these two platforms. In the end, it's increasing the monopoly power. And also another characteristic is datafication. So one of the limits of competition law in protecting workers and the gig economy is that the labor exemption, which exempts collective bargainings between employees and employers, does not apply to the gig economy, the gig workers, simply because these workers are characterized as employees. And another limitation is that when you look at most of the cases that have come and investigations against Uber, you'll find that even when there's an allegation that these platforms are engaging in predatory pricing, in most jurisdictions, most of these anti-competitive conduct has been described as pro-competitive. So there's a need, as many scholars have said, there's a need to start looking at some of the conduct that the digital labor platforms are engaging in as anti-competitive, instead of just focusing on the pro-competitive gains. And I'm not saying that there's no pro-competitive gains. So what should competition law do then? What is the potential? So one of the potential, and in which the Irish Competition Authority, the EU has come up with guidelines on exempting digital labor platforms from the labor exemption, is that there's a need to extend the labor exemption to gig workers, and there are many reasons to do that, which I will not. And one of them is that if this is done, the first question is, why should it be done? If you look at the EU guidelines on collective bargaining power of a digital labor platform, is that the criteria it uses is that it only applies to when the gig workers' employment conditions are being exploited. And honestly to speak, gig workers, whether in the global south or global north, have a weak bargaining power, and they're not able to negotiate for better terms when it comes to the powerful digital labor platform. The reason is that even if you look at gig workers in the global north, talking about the US, the EU, most of these workers are people of color, they're immigrants. So the bargaining power is very limited. So if the labor exemption is extended to gig workers, there's a possibility that they can unionize and negotiate for better working conditions. And in my fieldwork research, some of the preliminary findings I found is that most of the gig workers do not have unions to negotiate better terms for them. They only have WhatsApp groups where they discuss their issues. And this is one of the reasons why most of the big platforms can't decide how much commission they're going to do. They engage in unilateral conduct whereby there's unjustified termination of contracts and so on, and yet gig workers cannot negotiate better terms. Another issue is that when you look at gig workers, and the case law in the EU has shown, and even when you interact with them, you find that they're in the same situation as workers. The concept of flexibility for gig workers in developing countries is an illusion. They work for longer times. The gig platforms control them, especially on the working schedules. And they are economically dependent on these gig platforms. And one of the criteria that the EU is using in determining which gig workers should benefit from the EU labor exemption is the issue that if they accrue more than 50% of their income from one or two platforms, then it means that these gig workers are economically dependent on this. So that is one of them. So according to the Ireland, which they did amend the Act in 2017 and included a provision whereby they have recognized that there's a relevant category of self-employed people, and some of them are false self-employed. Other scholars will tell you that gig workers are not self-employed. They are a new category of employees that competition authority should look at. And there was a question that what should the competition authorities do? I think the first thing competition authorities should do is do research, maybe market inquiries, and find out the real relationship or the real employment status of gig workers, and find out the working conditions of these gig workers. And also another thing they should also find out is the business user competition between the digital labor platforms. This is because there's a lot of barriers within this market sector, and African digital labor platforms finding it difficult to enter and expand in the market because of network effects, because of consumer preference, consumer trust. This has given a number of platforms more advantage than others. And therefore, if we cannot be able to look at what Professor Cheng has said, the abuse of monopoly power, the issue of price discrimination is one issue that is really going to hinder the entry and the expansion of digital labor platforms beyond the big digital labor platform that we know. And as I finish, another issue we should look at is this need for coordination and collaboration between competition authorities and labor ministries, labor scholars, trade unions, to find out what is really happening in the sector, and also to find out the working condition of the gig workers, if gig workers from developing countries will benefit from the gig economy. Thank you.
I think you have raised a number of important points, and we'll come back to some of them, particularly about the development of the capacity of competition authorities to understand these issues. That, I think, is very, very important. Now, let me come to Daria Kotova. She's an expert at the BRIC Center in Moscow. Daria, the question before you, after you've heard all the speakers, that I guess many of these issues are also prevalent in Russia. So how is the Russian Competition Authority dealing with this issue? If you can explain them with some case studies, 1 or 2 case studies, so that would be good. Over to you, 10, 12 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you to CUTS. Thank you to CUTS for having us here. So it's a great opportunity for me today to exactly point out 2 cases that are that come from Russia and that are based at our current research and consultations that we did at the BRICS Competition Law and Policy Center recently. So the first one, and I mean, both of them are actually quite illustrative to what both Murat Umarov and Professor Cheng just told us. So the first one comes exactly from this ride-hailing market. So in Russia, we have this huge ecosystem basically of services. So it's not like Uber, which is a standalone ride-hailing platform. We have this ecosystem called Yandex that has quite an influential ride-hailing platform. But basically now it's a super app because apart from ride-hailing services, it also comprises food delivery, just delivery services, ride-sharing, and other forms of individual mobility. So these guys, they have been quite successful in evading all kinds of legal responsibility for like obviously anti-competitive behavior in Russia, like merger control issues. They had some merger control issues. They had some pricing abuses investigations against them, but everything was to no avail. And in terms of market shares, well, this is interesting. We have some like smaller competitors with their market shares being like almost negligible in the majority of the biggest cities around Russia. So Yandex, in most cases, Yandex has like a market share of over like 70%, which makes it basically a monopoly. So the biggest problem, like one of the biggest problem that we are now trying to get the competition regulators' attention to is algorithmic pricing, which I think also Professor Cheng mentioned, since, well, automated pricing currently raises this issue of transparency of the final price, and the issue of the fairness of value distribution along the value chain, meaning which, well, you have a consumer that is being charged a surge price because of some factors like weather conditions or traffic, and then the driver does not see the price that is charged to the consumer, and that the consumer doesn't really know which piece of this surge surge coefficient that increases the price actually goes to the driver. So, well, this issue was actually also raised quite recently in a really nice market study by the Competition Commission of India that pointed out price transparency and surge pricing as a huge concern and something to be monitored by the competition authority. And same was actually a concern in the recent Austrian market study by the Federal Competition Authority in Austria. So in Russia, the authorities, they tried to think of some ways to regulate algorithmic, just algorithmic abuses. But that mainly applied to fake news, stuff like this. They didn't really care about price-based algorithms that have something to do with price setting. And this, what we think is this is exactly like the angle where the FAS, the competition regulator in Russia, can intervene. So come up with a transparency framework or like mechanism that obliges platforms on certain conditions, of course, given all these confidentiality issues, to actually act upon algorithmic transparency. We do think this is within the competition regulator's competence. Well, this is exactly within its broader policy objectives and policy interests, because like algorithmic pricing apparently now in the digital economy is the root cause for many potential both exclusionary and exploitative abuses. So this is something the regulator definitely should look at. And this goes, in fact, beyond the gig economy, of course. Well, we already have some examples of competition authorities engaging in some form of controlling how the algorithms are used by digital platforms. We have this Amazon buy box case in Italy. I mean, yeah, it has nothing to do with, well, partly nothing to do with the gig economy, but the competition authority was quite successful in Italy's deciphering and like decomposing the black box behind the algorithm. That was a really great case. We have the European Digital Services Act that establishes an algorithmic audit system, which to my knowledge has not been applied yet. But again, it applies only to like consumer harm, doesn't really cover this harm that comes to competition from using algorithms, which is also like something that should be considered by regulators. We also have this Chinese example of algorithmic monitoring system that has been recently established in China and that companies in China are actually quite serious about. So, well, let's see how this is going to develop. But so second case is a little bit different. It is a particular case that the competition authority had some like really huge problems with, because everyone wanted the competition authority to intervene, but the competition authority actually said, no, we're not going to do that. So in Russia, we have this quite a vibrant market of online marketplaces, or basically e-commerce market. We have these owners of pickup points that enter into like adhesion agreements with the platform. So basically, they enter into these agreements unconditionally, and they accept the terms and conditions of the platform. They can't change that, even if they like would maybe want to propose some other like terms and conditions. They can do that because they just don't have the comparable level of bargaining power. So then the marketplace, what it did. Okay, that was like one particular marketplace that I'm not going to name, but I was actually already talking about this case in March here at COTS as well. So the marketplace starts to levy fines that are like unsustainable, unjust, unfair, with a very clear bias towards the platform. So basically, like the majority, like the bulk of of the problem is levied upon the providers of individual like services to the complementers of the ecosystem. So the sellers, the individual sellers, which basically have this contractual relationship with the platform. They try to either go to courts to bring a civil case, like a private litigation case, and then they fail, what they did was their last resort. They just went on and protested and tried to at least attract some attention from the regulators. So the reaction from the regulator was, well, we will not intervene because this is a contractual relationship between you and the platform. So you either go to court or you just try to negotiate some conditions that would be more favorable to you. So the issue that is being discussed now in the competition community in Russia and even in the broader public sphere, because it was quite a serious public outcry about this case. Can we say that these pickup delivery point owners are the ecosystem's workers if they have this contractual relationship? Are they complementers? I mean, how do we define their status? So the ecosystem, on the one hand, is hugely dependent on them because administrating proprietary pickup points would be quite costly. On the other hand, these people who engage in this business of opening these delivery points, they are very much economically dependent on the platform because in many smaller settlements around Russia, owning this delivery point that you come up with, haven't entered into an agreement with the platform, with the marketplace, is a really serious means of sustaining oneself and one's family. So this is something that is really important economically for many people around the country. So we have we can have two scenarios here, basically. Well, first of all, and this is something that has been mentioned recently, recognize these guys as workers, change the statute despite them having a clearly contractual relationship with the platform. So, for instance, the Russia's public prosecutor actually, after these protests and public outcry, initiated an inquiry into the violation of labor rights of these people who work for the platform and own this delivery services. We don't really know if that yielded any result because the case was apparently settled administratively. So most likely they just closed the case, the criminal case. And moreover, this is very often the question of the labor relations between the pickup point owner and just some guys that come to work for him. And these guys that actually sit there at these delivery points, they might not even have a labor contract with a pickup, with a pickup office owner. But still, in this case, if a platform levies a fine on the pickup point owner, the guy who's actually sitting there and giving you away the goods that he ordered is the one to pay the fine from his or her salary. So this is another question. So second scenario is turning on the competition law machine. So we have this abuse of bargaining power provision in our civil code, basically. And we even had one or several cases where either individual sellers, or I think it was individual sellers in that case, tried to negotiate more favorable conditions for this adhesion agreement with the marketplace. The marketplace, of course, said, well, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to change it. The sellers would go to court, and the court would say, very interestingly, they would refuse any claim based on this civil code provision on the inequality of bargaining position, saying that, well, look, the marketplace is not this particular marketplace. It's not a monopolist, and you can easily switch to another provider of ecosystem services. So, disregarding all questions of switching costs and things like this. So even for private courts, courts that deal with private litigation, there is a clear link between this inequality of bargaining position that we have in our private law and this bargaining position that is an element of market power or any other form of economic power that's adjacent to market power. We have some similar provisions on bargaining power for retail chains. They're not they're not directly dealing with superior bargaining position and this inequality of bargaining positions, even though they of course mean it. So we have this exemption, which is basically extended style, but for retail chains only. What is this? What does this whole thing leave us with? Well, again, as I said, for marketplaces, the Russian market is most likely quite competitive, I would say, because we have several of these marketplaces. But again, I know, could be hard to deal with this bargaining position in this case. But again, in Russia, we have these provisions on collective dominance that the competition authority can use to try and prove that these guys together hold some dominant position in the market, but quite hard to prove. We also should keep in mind the flexibility of the market definition, that the competition authority can well say that this particular platform has something specific to it that makes it basically non-interchangeable with other platforms in the market. And then just go down the road of proven like classical abuse of dominance. Another option would be to regulate these marketplaces and their relationships with both sellers and other complementers directly. And in fact, after that case of sellers and pickup point owners protesting the marketplaces, they came up with this initiative. Okay, let's do a huge all-embracing law that would regulate our relationships with sellers, with other complementers, taxation, liability questions, issues of anti-monopoly law. But I mean, well, is this really the way we want to deal with it? The option I think that we think at the BRICS Center would fit best, both for the first case that we have with Yandex drivers and for this case with marketplace platforms, would be to think how to frame these new forms of market power that include bargaining power, that include like architectural power along the value chain, into the provisions of our competition law. So we had some like recent amendments to the competition law that actually introduced some new forms of like new criteria of dominance for digital platforms, but these still do not tackle the issue, the root of ecosystem power and market power. Like they do not really enrich the law qualitatively. They really do not add nothing. So even given these amendments, the competition authority is still like powerless and unequipped to deal with cases like this. Like you have a contractual relationship, you have a inequality of bargaining positions. Apparently, you have several ecosystems or marketplaces that have certain degree of economic power, even if we're not talking like about market power as envisioned in the law. So apparently, well, there is something of interest for the competition authority in that case. So we really need to move forward. We really need the competition authority, as Vala said, maybe to come up with some market studies to, especially for this marketplace, for this e-commerce market. Look at the business models, look at the dynamics of competition between these different business models. Look at the market shares and how they can be approached like differently from a more, like from a broader understanding of economic power. So definitely this question of gig workers is something to be answered. I mean, especially in this case of Russia, where we have quite a vibrant competition authority, is to be answered by the competition authority. And competition authority, of course, should not say that we are not going to intervene because this is a contractual relationship. Well, this is just not even compatible with the law that they have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daria. I mean, I think there are a number of important points that you have raised. I'm particularly interested to know more about this algorithm, the audit of algorithm. I'm not clear on that, because that algorithms that as the heart and soul of my business. Why should I share it with somebody? That's the question which is coming to my mind. But anyway, I'll come back to you. Now let's hear from Uma Rani. She is a senior economist at the ILO, based in Geneva. So Uma, you have heard all the speakers, and that's the reason why I requested you to come at the end. Having heard them, what would be in your opinion, could be a roadmap for the welfare of gig workers? Not just platform-based gig workers, but workers who are engaged in the gig economy in its broader sense. Over to you, Ma, in about...
Thanks a lot for having me here, and thanks a lot for all the fascinating presentations from other speakers before me. I think I'd like to first lay down a bit more before I get into it. I do hear you, Bipul, when you say that, gig economy is far wider. It is a contractual employment. And, that's the way we should look at. And I think most of the people who are presented today have focused largely on platform economy per se. And the reason I want to bring these two together is our real understanding. As you very rightly mentioned, this is not new. this is old and this has been ongoing. How can we actually set it right? And I think that kind of a framing becomes quite important, actually, very clearly. Now, having said that, I'd like to say that, many people think that the minute you talk about platforms, this is a new form of employment, or this is something, completely new and we need to look at it. But I think what's very important for us to keep in mind is none of this is actually new. And all of this has been there in the traditional labor market and continues to be done in the traditional labor market. Whether you're talking about taxi drivers, whether you're talking about domestic workers or delivery workers or nurses, or even computer programmers or coders, all of this exists in the traditional market. But I think what is very important for us to recognize is, and what is different, is the technology that helps you mediate it. So you could be in the informal sector, working as a taxi driver as a self-employed. But what this platform does now is it further precaritizes you. Instead of using the technology to actually help you improve your working conditions, there's further exploitation and precaritization of the worker. And this happens through a number of ways, and one of the more fundamental ways it happens is through the algorithmic management practices, because the algorithm is what goes about allocating the task, monitoring the task, supervising it, and finally, rewarding it. And if a worker is not doing the work according to the satisfaction of the customer, which has now become the new way of reviewing, then you don't actually release the payments to it. Added to that, what is very new with these platforms is a kind of a commission fee. I think Professor Thomas Cheng very nicely talked about the anecdote in the San Francisco Bay Area, where you take a Uber and a driver only gets part of the earnings, because a large part of it goes as commission fee to the company itself. Now, this is again very new. This is something we have not really seen as part of the labor practices or labor contracting ever in the history of labor, in a way. And, this is also against the Private Employment Agency Convention of the ILO, which very clearly stipulates that no intermediate agency can go about actually charging workers a kind of a fee. And I think I wish Samar was here to hear a bit more about what some of the challenges of workers are, but I think a number of speakers from Professor Thomas to Vela have alluded to us what many of the, challenges that workers face, not only in terms of the employment relationships, but also in terms of earnings, working time, the kind of lack of social protection that is there. And also what is also important for us to realize is that, with technology and with algorithmic management practices and the kind of reviewing system you have today, it's very easy to deactivate workers. It's very easy not to provide them any access. And I think these issues need to be looked at very carefully before we talk about any kind of a roadmap for these workers. I think what I also found super interesting in this conversation today, and I think probably that's the way to also go about, is crossing the border when you're talking about workers from labor protection, labor law to competition law. Because competition law plays a very, very important role in the context of the platform economy today. Because there are parts of it that can be handled through the labor law process, but there are parts of it which need competition law, and there are parts of it, like the algorithms, which at the moment don't fall either in these two laws, but are part of the WTO trade treaties. And this relates to algorithmic transparency, because at the moment it's part of the trade secrecy rights. So having said that, let me come back to the labor law aspect of it. And just a point on competition law. Why competition law becomes very important for us to touch today is not only because, it used to be in the interest of the consumers at a point of time. And today, there is a very fine line that exists between a self-employed worker or a worker and a consumer. And you might think that, well, we are providing a consumer the services at a very low rate, but at the same time, either that particular worker who's actually getting paid is part of a household who could be a consumer as well as a worker. And I think in that context, it becomes very important for us to look at competition law per se and to rework what it looks like. Now, within the labor law dimension, I think there are, and I think the ILO brought out a report in 2021, which actually laid down that there are a number of areas where labor laws need to intervene, not only with regard to the employment status and the right to be able to bargain collectively and to provide social security benefits, but I think it's much more important for us to look also into the area of dispute resolution mechanisms. Now, what do I mean by that? I think India is probably one of the only countries in the global south, probably, where, if you're talking about Uber, you can take a case to the local court. In many other countries, if there is a dispute, then you have to take it to the Netherlands, which is where the court of jurisdiction is. And I think it's fundamentally important for us to ensure that if a business is operating in a particular country, then the disputes have to be handled within that jurisdiction, whether the local or its own apex organization. Then there are issues around fair termination process, because at the moment, it's a click of a button where a worker can be deactivated. And this is, after spending years or a lot of time to get the experience, to get a very good rating, to get a very good reputation, and a click of a button can deactivate you, and you have absolutely no way you can appeal, because there's nobody going to listen to you, because the customer cares of many of these platforms have no time for many of the workers, because they are mediating thousands of workers as a result. Then there are issues around occupation and safety and health. I don't think there's not much attention that is given. There are insurance schemes that have been brought about, but I think case studies after case studies and surveys after surveys have very clearly showed that many of the workers are actually not able to access them. Then there are issues around the whole issue of transparency and accountability of algorithms. I think you talked about algorithmic audits and how these are done. These are super complicated matters. I am aware of the French Ministry of Finance actually looking into it and trying to audit algorithms. But again, this requires huge computational powers, because you have to replicate and simulate that kind of a data. I think what would be fundamental and important, which is part of the EU directive, is to ensure how do you bring about algorithmic transparency. Again, there are questions about what is to be made transparent and how do you actually go about ensuring that the entire process is fair. Then there are issues around data protection. Again, this is something that labor law has started to look at it. And I think a lot of this automation that happens on these platforms is through the worker data that is being collected, that is again used for the machine learning process. And I think the question we need to ask is, to what extent the worker data can be protected so that the worker can actually get benefit out of it. And finally, I think what we see also is that there's absolutely no portability that is there, both with regard to worker data and ratings on these platforms. So, when you get deactivated on a platform, you have to start from scratch again, build up your rating. So as a result, it has huge impacts on the livelihoods. Now, at an international level, the kind of a roadmap that has been chalked out by the ILO is that we've been having discussions in our governing body and in the International Labour Conference. We had a tripartite expert meeting last year in October around the same time, where no conclusion came out, but the governing body took a decision to have a normative gap analysis to see to what extent the existing conventions and recommendations can actually address some of the decent working conditions of the workers in the platform economy, which would extend to a number of similar workers in other arenas. And it was felt that there are a number of gaps, and the governing body this year in March decided that there's a need to have a discussion on the decent work for the workers in the platform economy. And this discussion would happen in 2025, June. And towards this, the office is now working towards preparing a white report, which will be basically shared with the governments of who are party to the ILO, and we would take forward the discussion from there. Thank you so much for giving me.
Thank you, Uma. On your last point, I think we need to have some more reflection. But before we do that, and I also have a couple of points to discuss or to raise before you, and another point before Teresa of UNCTAD in this context of this discussion. But before I do that, let's open the floor for discussion, for questions, clarification, or any other point that you would like to add. I see Alan. Yeah, Alan first.
Thank you. It's about the possibility of market power in the hands of operators like Uber. And I think in one of the presentations, it described a marketplace in which the taxi company, or perhaps it was Uber, had 80% of the market. And then some others, like here in India, I think it's a much lower, more open one. And I'm just wondering if any of the presenters are aware of whether across those different markets, the percentage commission that the operator, Uber or whoever, take from drivers varies. In other words, in those concentrated markets, is there a market power effect that doesn't exist in some others, which gives us a bit of an indication about the competitiveness of the market?
Thank you, Alan. So let's take a few questions together. Then I'll come to the panelists. I see Pradeep.
Yeah, right.
Point.
But before these platform-based things came up, we've often seen freelance workers in various skill sectors like carpentry or handyman services, etc., who have, in fact, always been in the buyer's market. They have exploited this. I mean, if you call them for any particular service, or let us say a jewel cutter or a jewelry maker. Now, all these have been gig workers. None of them have been organized labor employed by the owner, but they all work on quite often what we call piece rate. These are the number of pieces which you deliver, and this is what you're getting paid. And as I said, again, let me reiterate, quite often we found that this level of skills, even in urban centers in India, they are in the seller's market. You can't get these services when you want them. So we have to look at that aspect as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one more question, then I'll come to the panelist. I'll come back to you in a second round. Ujjwal?
I just want to add one thing, that state of Rajasthan in India, where our headquarters is Cuts International, and has passed a law for the welfare of platform-based gig worker, and it is not yet enforced. but the mechanism is like they will charge 1% or 50% of cess from consumers, and we go for the welfare of gig worker platform-based gig workers. So this can be one way to kind of compensate what we can say that failure of governing the monopoly power, either by the constitutional law or by any example law.
Thank you. On the first two questions, I think, Thomas, you are in a better position to answer those questions. The third one, I think, more for Uma. So I'd like to hear from her. Thomas, over to you.
So I don't have direct data on the question Alan asked. Although my impression is the ride-hailing market in the US is supposed to be fairly competitive, and if my Uber driver pays a 30-something% commission on his ride, then I guess even competition in the downstream market does not seem to be a very effective constraint on the buyer power upstream. But here I want to point out something, which is that we need to remind ourselves that seller market power and buyer market power function quite differently. Of course, when we talk about market power, what we are really asking ourselves is, are there meaningful substitutes for the consumer on the one hand, or in the downstream market, or a different platform on the other hand in the upstream market for an Uber driver? So the question is reasonable substitutes, meaningful substitutes. When a consumer is looking for a substitute for a smartphone, is just one of the many purchases he or she makes. It is not, a lot of us would like to think smartphone is our life, but at the end of the day, it is not about a livelihood. Whereas if you're talking about a driver or even a supplier on marketplaces, actually my presentation comes from an article where I actually looked at Uber and Amazon. And so for a lot of these sellers on Amazon, they are looking for a substitute for 70-80% of their output. And looking for a different smartphone is much easier than looking for a place to sell 70-80% of your entire output. And so my point is a much smaller market share would give buyers buyer power. And that is why, for example, the UK Competition Commission has held that 8% market share in the downstream market gives, I believe it was a supermarket case, a supermarket buyer power upstream. So I guess my point is a much smaller market share in the downstream market can give a buyer power upstream because the fact is the seller of the input, the labor, service, or goods, in the case of an online marketplace, is looking for a place to sell 50, 60, 80% of its output. It is much harder than looking for another smartphone. So I think market power needs to be understood differently in the seller context and the buyer context. But I think that's all I'll say.
Thank you, Thomas. Uma, would you like to talk about the third question, which is about the Rajasthan platform-based gig workers welfare bill? It's yet to become an act. Yes.
Yes, for sure. I think it is a very good step in a good direction. And I think what it does is tries to touch upon social security and accident insurance. But I think this is, for me, just a beginning for a lot more reforms that needs to become for workers, not only in the platform economy, but overall gig economy.
Thank you. So let's take a few more questions. The gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Tembigos Bonakele from South Africa. There is also, especially in developing countries, competition for capital. In other words, competition for investment. Remember, these platforms are global, and they can go anywhere, and they can choose where not to go. And where you have this platform in most parts of the world making losses, that competition becomes even more important. How do you deal with this issue of clamping down on their dominance vis-a-vis consumers and the national imperative to compete in the global market for capital?
Thank you. I see that there is another hand there. Yeah, Sanchita.
Thank you. My question is about regulating algorithms. Apart from the complexity thing and these being trade secret, technology that is being applied for this algorithm can change very quickly. So are government authorities around the world looking at what kind of research and development is taking place vis-a-vis, these platform based companies, So whatever technology they're applying now, the way they are deciding the algorithm, these could change by the time new regulations may come in. So are they looking at these things? Are they thinking of adopting forward-looking regulations?
Thank you. So, Daria, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So yes, definitely they are adopting this forward-looking regulation. For instance, if you look at the DSA, the Digital Services Act in the European Union, they have these audits that are supposed to be conducted annually, I think. So basically, much can change in the business of a particular company. But again, for the DSA, and this is very specific, they have a huge question as to the transparency and impartiality of these audits, because the way the auditing process is laid down in the DSA, it actually raises questions as to whether a platform can kind of contract people who will audit its business that can be in some way influenced by the platform itself. So in my opinion, and this is also what we have been trying to propose with competition authority, is that maybe establishing some form of a monitoring trustee or monitoring foundation, much like the in the case of the open banking in the UK, where there was a home view market, not like a market regulator, but a non-governmental kind of authority comprised of regulator and the businesses that was actually implementing new banking mechanisms into the market. Well, we can think of something like this, something like for the regulator and for the competitors to come in to come up together and create some kind of a monitoring mechanism that would have access to data on strict confidentiality conditions, that would monitor what's happening in the R&D, and that would be able to at least guide the market towards more sustainable form of functioning. But I don't really have any examples of these now happening anywhere in the world. But well, let's see what happens.
Thank you. Joseph, let me put this question on investment decisions to you and also rephrase it a bit. That do you think that investors, they are taking into account workers' welfare as a factor before taking their decision? Joseph, would you like to address this question?
I think the labor standards are something that are taken into consideration. But is it they are such a decisive force to to have an impact on the decision? That I'm not sure.
Sorry, Joseph. Is that your answer, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you are asking me if the labor standards is a cutting point for investment or not. I think there are many more factors than just the.
Okay, I get your point. Yeah.
Yes.
See, I think the question was that whether there is competition for investment, right? And whether these companies, and there are not many companies in this space, when you talk about specific sectors, and the markets are also very segmented. So for when there is competition for investment, so that is another form of dominance, right? And maybe some of these companies are quote unquote abusing that part of their dominance while making investment decisions. And maybe that workers who are engaged in those sectors, they are at a receiving end. These are all hypothetical questions. So I don't know. I mean, I am we're yet to come across. I haven't come across any deep research on this question. We are in one of our projects. We are looking into this particular question, whether investors they are taking into account worker welfare, not just worker welfare, but ESG as a whole, and all its component as an important factor before making investment decisions. Now, after hearing all of you, one thing which is very, very clear to me that while the gig economy or the gig sector, there are many, many sectors here. Gig economy is certainly not new. It's undergoing various form of changes, but it's also certainly becoming more and more complex. Yeah. It's not the traditional monopsony, blockpsony, those kind of stuff, or monopoly, if we look at it from that angle. It's not no longer that. It's becoming more and more complex. The markets are becoming more and more segmented. There are other structural issues in these markets. That calls for, to me, I mean, at a very basic level, two things. One is we have to have top class lawyers and economists, particularly industrial organizations, those who are dealing with that subject in our competition agencies. I'm not sure about. I'm not aware of other countries. Not much aware, but I think in case of India, I'm not sure about that, and that's a diplomatic answer. I think there comes the role of contact, Teresa, your branch. You have that responsibility to do research on all these complexities. And I understand that more and more donors, they are becoming more and more comfortable in working with intergovernmental. But it's not just your division at UNCTAD. You have to also work in collaboration with competition agencies, think tanks like us, to understand, to have better understanding of this market in its complexities, in its totality, to develop the capacity of competition agencies and other stakeholders in this field. Because whether we like it or not, see, the days of permanent employment, quote unquote, those kind of industries having big chimneys, emitting carbon dioxide, those days are over, I can share it. It was over in the Western world long time back. It's going to be over in the in our part of the world now, I mean, within few decades. So we have entered into a new form of economic activities in various sense. So that is my question or point before you. So what you are thinking in developing, in doing research and developing the capacity of competition agencies, consumer organizations, uh, think tanks like us in understanding this market and making incremental progress towards the betterment of everyone, all stakeholders. There is our thing.
Thank you. Quite a big answer, a big question about such a complex topic. Let me tell you that a year and a half ago, at the end of our annual intergovernmental group of experts meeting on competition law and policy, when we discussed informally with member state representatives and other stakeholders the topics for this year, the OECD member states proposed competition in monopsony markets, mostly because of the work that the OECD Secretariat and a number of OECD competition authorities have done in relation to labor markets. And I should confess that my initial reaction was that this was not a priority for developing countries. And of course, that is my job as the Secretariat of UNCTAD to choose issues that are in some cases emerging, but that are already of concern to developing countries. And yet we did the first background note on competition in monopsony markets, frankly, splitting between the labor markets, where we could only find examples of developed countries, mostly from the European Union and the US, but also abuse of market power, of buyer power, sorry. And of course, from that point of view, that is quite interesting. And there were a number of examples in the paper that I can recommend that was discussed in this July IGA meeting. I think, of course, the Uber and other cases are much more complex because, of course, this combines, well, new technologies, digital economies. I would say that because I have a double mandate on consumer protection as well, we are quite familiar with a number of issues that all of us as consumers face with this type of platforms. I am still not, how can I put it, certain that this can be identified from our point of view as a major issue across the world. Again, focusing on developing countries, it is true that especially in, I would say, Asia, the rise of e-commerce, the proliferation of digital platforms and environments are very inviting to the development of technologies. And this, of course, generates a number of opportunities and challenges. But I'm still not personally certain that this is a priority, but I do take your point on the research and analysis, of course, considering the very limited resources. I would appeal to my colleague from the ILO because UNCTAD, we deal with a lot of issues under the broad chapeau of international trade and development, as I mentioned, finance, investment, technology, logistics. The technology from the point of view of science and technology and e-commerce as such from the point of view of supporting developing countries to create an enabling environment. Of course, my team deals with competition and consumer protection. It's a very, very vast, two very vast areas of work. But yes, I thought the ILO colleague comments were very interesting, and I am sure there is work to be done on this. My initial reaction, and this already concerns what we will be discussing this afternoon, is that I personally would not pick this as one of the priorities of my work, but I'm very much open to hear from everybody. I think the choice of topics for this conference actually is wide enough, diverse enough, and interesting enough for that. But if anybody has very strong feelings, please contact me and my team, and we are quite happy to follow up. Thank you.
Pradeep.
To promote issues of developing country interest. But just to respond to this particular debate that we are having on labor sector vis-a-vis competition, it is now becoming a problem in large number of developing countries, and there is a great interest in both Africa and Asia, as I see from the kind of discussion we are having. As we speak, this debate is being watched by many in Africa and in Asia also particularly. So there is a great interest. What I suggest is that as we do the World Competition Day, the theme this year is again, we're taking the same theme as the headline here, prioritizing socially sensitive sectors. So, Teresa, I'm in Geneva on 5th of December. Or you're there also, and I think we can get Uma Rani also and others to speak about at least some of these points, including the other points that comes out from this seminar, in order to take it forward. And that would then also become a kind of an indication for other countries to follow. At least thanks to the effort that was made by UNCTAD and CUTS, that World Competition Day is now recognized by at least 50 countries in the world. And they are observing it. And therefore we could, we prepared a more detailed paper on this. But let me say that let us agree to do an event 2-hour event in Geneva when I'm there on the 5th. So there'll be so many other things happening. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's important. We have to take this agenda. This is very, very important agenda for all of us. For the simple reason that these sectors are going to grow. There will be more and more such employment, and they're making important contributions to our growth. And that brings me to Uma, that I'm glad that you mentioned the work that you are doing in the normative sense. I think that's the way forward. Not just what it is today, but to talk to stakeholders what it should be. Yeah. And do that gap analysis and see whether institutions are there to fill those gaps. And the essence of what Pradeep and our 2 other guests, they discussed yesterday evening, that we are quite good at coming out with policies, laws, fairly good regulations. But when it comes to implementation, we are not that good. So that's also very, very important. So Uma, I think, and also the timeline which you said about 2025, I think it's also time for us to work together, to come out with a global compact on growth and employment. Because otherwise, we are going to see more and more social disturbances, among other factors. They are there already. So unless we have better employment, it's not just employment, better employment, then I think we are going to see more social unrest. So I'll hear from Uma on this point. But before that, I think, Thomas, you want to make a brief point? Very briefly. Then Uma, and then I'm going to close the show.
Before 30 seconds.
Yes, please.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Just to reiterate that, Teresa, this is also part of a G20 recommendation and B20 recommendation also. And if you go deeper into B20, Business 20, of which I was a member of what is called the Council for African Economic Integration, one of the 5 policy areas for thrust has been the issue about worker skilling. So we are looking at many of these areas, but for which the discourse is now at a very high level. Thank you.
I'll just keep it very brief. I think on the discussion that's going on, I kind of partly share your view and I also partly share Teresa's view. Where I agree with you is that I think it is an important issue. I think the use of algorithms to target drivers or to practice price discrimination, if I can use that term, against drivers is going to become more and more common across the world. I guess we're seeing that in the developed world now. I think it's only a matter of time before it will arrive at the global south as well. And let's not forget, with gig workers, there is a important development dimension, poverty reduction. Pradeep mentioned craftsmen, carpenters. I think this kind of employment opportunities is very important for these people to try to get out of the poverty ladder. But at the same time, I also share Teresa's view. I think on the kind of gig work exploitation, labor law probably has a bigger role to play. I think Umar's presence here is very important because the kind of issues that we're dealing with is mostly wealth transfer from seller to buyer, work exploitation. And at the end of the day, competition law is not going to change the uneven bargaining position between the Ubers of the world and the drivers. I think it is through labor law, for example, perhaps introducing unionization, etc., to strengthen the bargaining position of the workers, that where we can make the biggest difference. Because if you look at what Uber does, all that Uber does is to offer different compensations to different drivers. And I'm not sure really what competition law can do in this instance to address the situation. I think ultimately the problem is the uneven bargaining position between the platforms and the workers. And I think the best solution is to strengthen the bargaining position of the workers. That's all I have.
Thank you. So, Uma, let's hear from you on this imperative of collaboration and how you see it.
Yeah, I want to also respond to some of the things that have been said because I think it's super important.
Briefly.
Yes, briefly. I won't get too much into the details. I think it's often taken as an easy way to say that, well, we need these jobs because they reduce poverty. And my point here is that, and Professor Thomas, I want to say that what you see in US is already coming to many developing countries. We don't need to wait. I think instead of reducing poverty in many of these countries, it is actually precaritizing it. I think that's something we need to understand. Surveys after surveys, studies after studies are bringing this out. The second point I do want to make is where competition law has an impact. A lot is within the labor law, labor standards, which is very important for us to look at. But one place where competition law can play an important role is ensure that platform companies are fair and they are not undercutting and having unfair competition. I think this is an issue that can be easily tackled with, and this is something that should be done. The third point I would like to raise, and that would be all, is ILO has already conducted the normative gap analysis. And the normative gap analysis has very clearly brought out a number of gaps that are there in the conventions and recommendations with regard to protecting workers, because a number of these conventions, in a way, try to handle wage workers, and these platform companies try to actually classify workers as self-employed. And those workers are not really covered within these conventions. So the reason why we are moving towards a standard setting process is to ensure that all workers are protected. Now, with regard to moving forward, I think the office has a very clear-cut procedure that needs to be followed, and which is basically consultations with constituents, that is the governments, platform companies, and employers, as well as workers, both the traditional trade unions, as well as new forms of worker associations that have come up. So I think this would be the process that would be followed as we move towards a discussion on the standard setting. And we are planning to have a policy observatory to bring together the different initiatives that have been taken across the world so that countries can look at best practices and try to see how they can adapt it to their country circumstances. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Uma. Before I close this session, Marat and Vela, would you like to add any point briefly, half a minute to 1 minute? Would you like to react to some of these discussion points?
Yeah, of course. So maybe just one main point I would like to add is that competition law as it applies to the gig economy goes beyond the consumer welfare. And it also has to look at the harms that workers are facing, and platform competition between the large platforms and the small platforms that are entering the market. That is it.
Thank you. Marat, would you like to say, react to some of these points in 30 seconds? Are you there? Marat. I think he's not there. So let's conclude this session. I think it was very good, rich discussion. We have a number of issues for discussion, which we have made a note of them, and we'll see that how best we can take them forward in various forms. Pradeep has already concretized one such idea for a round of discussion in Geneva on 5th of December on the occasion of the World Competition Day. It's difficult for me to summarize, but one particular point which is coming to my mind is easy, quite easy. At the same time, I think important is that we cannot leave everything to the market, naturally. We cannot leave everything to the government, of course, naturally. Government's job is not to produce watches, but government's job is to come out with good regulations and implement them. And there's a very, very important role that the civil society has to play. Civil society, think tanks. I mean, the whole civil society in the broader sense, business associations, trade unions, everybody has to play in this context in order to enhance, not just protect, but to enhance, not just protect workers' welfare or workers' rights, etc., but enhance their welfare, not just protect consumers, but enhance consumer welfare. And that is the motto of cuts over the last 40 years. Therefore, it's not this or that, but we have to find a better way, a third way. And I think one of our thought leaders have spoken about it long time back, 70 years ago, 70, 75 years ago. And we need to revisit that, the third way by Datto Panthengari. And it's very easily available in our in the internet. I would request all of you to read that booklet, The Third Way. And answers to many of these questions may be found there. Thank you very much. Let's break for tea and coffee. And we're going to be back in 12 minutes from now. Thank you.
Thank you so much.